Please comment where you are watching in the world. Please also send us your scary stories via email or to our subreddit. Thank you, let's begin. Story 1. Alright, let me tell you about one of the most unsettling experiences I've ever heard during my rotation in a burn unit. Now, let me preface this by saying that burn units are inherently heavy places. The air is thick, not just with the smell of antiseptic and charred flesh, but with the weight of suffering. Burn injuries aren't like anything else. They're devastating, slow to heal, and they leave scars, physical, emotional, and psychological. This story will haunt me forever. The story starts with a woman who might have had a shot at doing something better. But life wasn't kind, and she'd ended up working as a prostitute under a pimp who, by all accounts, was a real piece of crap. You hear about guys like him all the time, violent and manipulative. And one night, for reasons we'll never fully understand, he decided to make a point by setting the poor girl on fire. Now here's where things take a twisted turn. Instead of collapsing or running, this woman, this absolute force of a human being, grabbed him. She wrapped her arms around him in a bear hug, dragging him into the flames with her. I don't know if it was desperation, rage, or just pure instinct, but she made damn sure he wasn't walking away unscathed. By the time someone managed to put the fire out, both of them were in critical condition. She had burns over most of her body, including her lungs from inhaling the flames, and he wasn't much better off. They ended up in the same burn unit with us, though the staff made sure to keep them on opposite ends of the ICU. Even so, the tension was palpable. You could feel it every time you walked down the hall, like the air itself was heavier and heavier. She was fighting to stay alive, every breath a struggle, while he was holed up in his room, angry and bitter, and probably in more pain than he'd ever admit. For weeks, the two of them existed in this strange, silent standoff. She wasn't strong enough to talk much, and he certainly wasn't saying anything about what had happened. But the nurses whispered about it when they thought no one was listening. They talked about her strength, her defiance, the way she'd refused to let him walk away from what he'd done. They also talked about him, about the way he avoided eye contact, the way he flinched whenever he caught a glimpse of her through the glass of her room. It was like he couldn't escape her, even from across the unit. And then one night, everything came to a head. It had been a rough day already. The kind of day where the machines beeped too loudly, and the smell of burned flesh seemed to cling to your skin, no matter how many times you scrubbed. That night, she coded. Her body just couldn't take it anymore. Between the burns, the infections, and the damage to her lungs, it was too much. The staff did everything they could, but after nearly half an hour of trying to bring her back, they had to call it. She was gone. The room went quiet after that. The kind of quiet that feels unnatural, like the world is holding its breath. The nurses cleaned her up, whispered a few words of comfort to her lifeless body, and then pulled the curtain around her bed. It was over. Or at least, it should have been. About 30 minutes later, just as the unit was starting to settle back into its usual rhythm, the screaming started. It came from the far end of the hall, from his room. At first, it was incoherent, a raw, guttural sound that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. But then the words started to come through, clear and sharp and full of panic. "Get her out! Get the goddamn bitch out of my room." The nurses froze. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. We all just stood there, staring down the hallway toward his room, listening as he kept screaming. "She's here. She's in my room. Get her out." Now, let me remind you, this guy was on the opposite end of the unit. There was no way he could have known what had just happened. No one had told him she'd died. Hell, no one had even been in his room recently. But there he was, screaming bloody murder, thrashing against the restraints that kept him from pulling out his IVs and ripping the bandages off his burned skin. A couple of nurses rushed to his room, trying to calm him down. I followed, more out of morbid curiosity than anything else. When I got there, I saw it, the sheer, unfiltered terror in his eyes. This wasn't the anger or pain we'd gotten used to seeing from him. This was something else entirely. He was pale, shaking, his eyes darting around the room like he was watching something the rest of us couldn't see. "She's here," he kept saying, his voice cracking. "She's standing right there. Get her out." The nurses tried to reassure him, telling him there was no one else in the room, that he was safe, but he wasn't having it. He kept pointing to the corner, his finger trembling. "She's right there," he hissed. "She's watching me." I can't explain it, but for a split second I felt it too. This presence. The air in the room felt heavier, colder, like something was pressing down on us. I glanced toward the corner he was pointing at, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw something, a shadow, or maybe just a trick of the light. Whatever it was enough to make my stomach drop. Eventually, they sedated him, and the screaming stopped. But the feeling in the room didn't go away. Even after he was unconscious, it lingered, like the walls themselves were holding on to it. None of us said anything as we left the room, but I could tell I wasn't the only one who felt it. The nurses looked shaken, their faces pale, their hands trembling as they adjusted their scrubs and tried to get back to their routines. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. About the timing, about the way he'd started screaming almost exactly 30 minutes after she died. About the look in his eyes, like he was staring straight into hell. And about that corner of the room, the one he kept pointing at. The next morning, I asked one of the senior nurses if she'd ever seen anything like that before. She just gave me a tight-lipped smile and said, "You'd be surprised what happens in this place." And then she walked away, leaving me with more questions than answers. I don't know what he saw that night. I don't know if it was guilt, trauma, or something else entirely. All I know is that after she died, he wasn't the same. He stopped making eye contact, stopped yelling at the staff, stopped fighting the treatment. It was like all the fight had gone out of him. A few weeks later, he was discharged to a long-term care facility, and that was the last I heard of him. Story 2. I'm a psychiatric nurse. Early in my career, I worked at a residential mental health facility. There was a resident I'll call Marion Duchesne. He was an elective mute, which simply means that he couldn't talk, but there were no pathological findings as to why. He had spoken earlier in his life, and in fact seemed quite normal back then, with the notable exception of being close to 7 feet tall. He'd been raised in the Deep South and joined the military when he was 19. After boot camp, he was stationed somewhere in the South. One night, he just vanished. It was declared an AWOL for years, and finally he was declared missing and dead. 10 years later, a 7-foot-tall man walked into a VA hospital emergency room in my part of the Midwest and said to the receptionist, "My name is Marion Duchesne, and I've been dead for 10 years. Those were the last words he ever spoke. He was covered with dust, and he was wearing the same clothes he'd been reported to be wearing the night he vanished. His social security number had not been used, and he had no identification on his person. However, they were able to identify him, I guess via fingerprints. He was well-fed and in good health, except for his refusal to speak. The family was notified, but they said they had already grieved their lost man, and that whomever was claiming to be him simply could not be. They said he was a haint, and a stand-in for their dead relative, and demanded not to be contacted again. Marion paced all day every day, not in a frantic way, but just lumbering up and down the halls and outside. He smiled all the time, and would be moving his mouth in a way that indicated talking or muttering, but he was dead silent. He had an unnerving habit of throwing his head back with his mouth wide open, as if he were laughing heartily, but not even a breath could be heard. If told to go to the dining room for a meal, he'd go and eat. But if nobody told him, he just kept pacing, never indicating hunger. If offered a cigarette, he'd smoke it in an oddly formal way, almost delicately, if that makes sense. But he never seemed to crave smoking. The man wanted nothing. If I talked to him, he appeared to listen, periodically throwing his head back in that laughter-mimicking way of his. There was nothing to do for this man. Various medications were tried, but they did not affect him either positively or negatively. Occupational therapy did nothing because Marion would just grin, and unless told to stay put, he'd get up and start pacing again. On my last day at that job, on my way to something better, the last thing I saw was Marion, pacing in the parking lot, throwing his head back to laugh. Later I wondered if all along I'd been dealing with a ghost. All these years later, I still don't know. A story to share too on top of this I heard. This is a story that was told to me by a nurse who worked in a nursing home in a small Texas town. Now, in this nursing home there were 2 wings which were connected by a hallway. Compared to the front wing, the back was always a bit heavy with gloom, maybe even spooky at times. Not sure how to explain it, but there was certainly a darker atmosphere. For this reason, the nurses disliked staying in the back, so after the residents were in bed, and the night's last rounds were completed, they would migrate to the front nurses' station. This nightly trek went on for a while, until the administration learned of it, and for liability reasons, instructed the back wing nurses to stay in their assigned place of duty. There were always ghostly happenings. Nonetheless, these incidents were mostly shrugged off as the imagination of tired and overworked employees. But there was one incident in particular that was quite terrifying and witnessed by several people. One resident, Mr. Gomez, was rumored to have been into brujeria asterisk throughout his life. Late at night, Mr. Gomez, according to reports from other residents, would creep into their rooms. Like a serpent born of hell, he would slither on his stomach, his arms at his sides. His eyes would be rolled back in his head, his tongue darting in and out of his mouth, flicking the air like a human snake. He would crawl under their beds and try to push them off. "He's the devil," the other residents would claim. Well, the reports weren't taken very seriously. After all, these old folks were half out of their minds. And realistically, how could feeble old Mr. Gomez, who needed the assistance of nurses just to get out of bed, be physically capable of such actions? The nurses all agreed that the reports were just imagined stories of old, confused people. That is until the terrifying night that the nurses all became believers of the evil that lived within Mr. Gomez. It was well past midnight, the residents were sleeping, and the halls were quiet. The nurses had gathered in the back lobby to sit and wait for morning. Most of them were at the point of dozing off when a loud gasp broke the silence. One of the nurses stood up, a frightful expression upon her face. She pointed down the hall towards the residents' rooms. As the others turned to look, a horrifying scene unfolded. It was Mr. Gomez, slithering on his stomach, making his way down the hall and into the room of a slumbering woman. They just stood there, petrified, unsure of what to do. Mr. Gomez was now crawling through the hallway, heading right towards the lobby and the fear-struck nurses. The stories were true. Mr. Gomez was slithering like a snake, his eyes rolled back, and his tongue flicking in and out like a cursed beast. They watched as he snaked through the lobby furniture, crawling between chair legs and hissing at the shocked women. The nurses all ran up the hallway to the front desk. The doors to the back wing slammed shut as the last one passed through. They stayed up front for the next few hours, and as the sun began to peek over the horizon, they gathered enough courage to go check on the back wing. Everything was quiet, and Mr. Gomez was once again sleeping in his bed. A few nights later, Mr. Gomez passed away. As the nurses were attending to his body, several loud thumps were heard against the window. They pulled open the drapes to see what could have made the noise. And just as they did, a lechuza asterisk flew at the window, clawing at the pane as if trying to get in. The bird then flew into a nearby tree and landed among several other lechuzas perched high in the branches. The birds just stared down at the room where Mr. Gomez lay dead, waiting to claim his soul. Some words to share the meaning below, to help the above make sense. Brujeria equals Spanish word for witchcraft. Lechuza equals Spanish word for owl. Some believe that certain witches can transform themselves into lechuzas. Sometimes they are seen as a bird with a witch's head. Other times they look like a regular owl. Story 3. Yar vet nurse here. We've got the advantage over human medical staff of being able to euthanize in terminal cases, or where we can't afford to treat. I am forever grateful for that ability. I can't imagine working somewhere where the ability to give that final mercy was taken away, because sometimes it is absolutely necessary. Sometimes there are things we can do, but the question has to be whether we should do them for the animal's sake. Some of my worst cases that I've ever had to nurse are ones where the animal should have been euthanized, but we've been unable to get owner permission. A few examples. A 6mo Rottie pup that gave itself grape toxicity at 3mo and ruined most of its kidneys. Pulled through that episode by a hair's breadth after weeks in hospital on fluids. Was allowed to get into grapes again. Gave itself acute on chronic renal failure. Was anuric in bloods, indicated renal values off the charts, even with dilution. Basically meant total failure of the kidneys. Short of hemodialysis and new kidneys, this dog was already dead. It just hadn't actually died yet. Owners point blank refused euthanasia, even after multiple vets explained that their dog had a 0% chance of survival, and its remaining time would be in a hospital cage, surrounded by strangers, suffering extreme nausea and crippling pain until it died. They still refused. We drugged it up to its eyeballs and spent 2 days watching it die. I'm glad I never had to interact with the owners, because I have never wanted to punch someone more than I wanted to punch them. Cat in such severe respiratory distress that it needed to stay in the same position and take 16 gasps for breath per minute, or it would start to suffocate, even on 50% oxygen. I had to watch it for nearly 10 hours of a 12-hour shift. Poor girl had to pee where she sat because moving took too much effort. Couldn't eat, drink, sleep. Couldn't even lay down. It took another 16 hours or so of the same, and us trying every treatment we could think of with no success before I snapped and told the vets they had to talk to the owners again about quality of life. because I couldn't sit there and watch the cat fatigue its way to respiratory failure overnight. Dog that had eaten slug bait and was having non-stop seizure activity for 30 minutes before it arrived. Non-stop seizures basically cook the body from the inside, as well as causing hypoxic brain damage. Dog was 42C when it arrived to us, and probably had been for over 5 minutes. So chance of functional survival was extremely slim. Owners wanted to give it some time. Fair enough, it's a shock, we get it. But the dog went downhill, and nothing we could do was helping. We were just throwing their money at a dead dog at this point, and they turned off their phone. I spent 12 hours sitting with their dog, watching it shit out its gastric lining, which for the record looks like period chunks and smells like death. Watching it unconsciously vomit up cups of slug bait, putting it on a ventilator because they said they wanted all measures taken when we could contact them, knowing everything I did was futile. They euthanized it 3 hours after my shift finished when we could finally contact them again, but I still can't look at that bright slug bait turquoise blue without feeling sick. Another story for you to share. Now, I wasn't a nurse or a doctor or anything glamorous like that. No heroics, no life-saving procedures. I was just the guy delivering food trays, the lowly peon making sure patients got their diabetic-friendly pudding cups and low-sodium soups. It wasn't exactly thrilling work, but most days it was manageable. Most days, I could get through my shift without too much trouble. But this day has haunted me ever since. It started like any typical shift. I was wheeling the meal cart through the hallways, calling out room numbers, dropping off trays, smiling politely, and trying my best to avoid any major disasters. Then I got to that room. Room 217. I still remember the number, because I don't think I'll ever scrub it from my brain. Now, the thing about hospitals, especially older ones, is that they have smells. You get used to a lot of them over time. Antiseptic, faintly sour sweat, the metallic tang of blood. But the smell coming out of room 217? That was on a whole other level. It hit me before I even opened the door. A thick, cloying stench that clung to the back of my throat and made my eyes water. It was a mix of rotting meat, unwashed skin, and something sharp and chemical like ammonia. I gagged, right there in the hallway, and I hadn't even stepped inside yet. But, professionalism and all that. I took a deep breath, big mistake. Plastered on my, "I'm just here to deliver your food" smile, and pushed the door open. The room was small, like most of the hospital rooms on that floor, with 2 beds crammed in side by side. Except in this case, only one of the beds was occupied. The other one was empty, shoved as far away as possible toward the window. And now I understood why. The guy in the bed had a foot that looked like it belonged in one of those horror movies, where people get infected with some kind of flesh-eating virus. I'm talking full-on necrosis. Most of his toes were black, shriveled, and dead, like they'd been dipped in tar and left to rot. The rest of his foot wasn't much better, swollen, red, oozing in places. It looked like it was halfway through decomposing, while still attached to his body. And the smell? Oh, the smell was somehow even worse now that I was standing in it. I could feel it sticking to my skin, soaking into my clothes. I had to deliver his tray, though. It's not like I could just back out and leave. So I did what I always did in these situations. Focus on the task, get in, and get out as quickly as possible. I grabbed his tray off the cart and started to make my way around the foot of his bed. The space was tight, barely enough room to squeeze between the bed and the wall. But I'd done it 100 times before. No big deal. Except this time, as I was carefully maneuvering the tray, so I wouldn't knock it into any equipment, I felt it. Something brushed against my leg. I froze. For a split second, I thought maybe it was just the blanket hanging off the bed or a loose wire from the equipment. But then I looked down, and there it was. His toenail. His big, blackened, necrotic toenail, just barely hanging on to what was left of his rotting foot, now stuck to my leg. I'm not talking about a tiny piece of nail either. This was the whole damn thing, complete with a chunk of dead, grayish flesh still attached to it. It had come off when I brushed past his foot, and now it was just there, clinging to the fabric of my pant leg like some grotesque parasite. The guy and I locked eyes. For a moment, we just stared at each other in horrified silence, like we were both trying to process the absolute nightmare unfolding in front of us. His face turned this awful shade of pale green, and I'm pretty sure mine did too. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the tray, rip off my pants, and run. But somehow, I managed to keep it together. I cleared my throat, which felt like it had a lump the size of a baseball in it, and forced myself to speak. Here's your tray," I said, my voice unsteady. "Is there anything else you need?" He didn't respond. He just kept staring at me, his eyes wide, his mouth slightly open like he couldn't believe what had just happened either. I carefully set the tray down on his table, made a few small adjustments to make it easier for him to reach, and wished him a good day. Then I turned and walked out of the room as calmly as I could manage, all while that damn toenail was still stuck to me. The second I got out of the room, I ran. I didn't care who saw me sprinting down the hallway like a lunatic. I just needed to get to the nurse's station and have someone help me deal with this horror show. When I got there, I was practically shouting. "I need help," I said, my voice cracking. There's a toenail on me." The nurses looked up, confused at first, but when they saw my face and the toenail, they sprang into action. One of them, bless her soul, grabbed a pair of gloves and a pair of tweezers and carefully plucked the thing off my pant leg. It made this awful sticking sound as it came away, like peeling tape off a surface that's been left too long. I swear I almost threw up right then and there. But the nurse wasn't done. She grabbed a bottle of disinfectant, some industrial strength stuff that smelled like it could dissolve steel, and poured it directly onto the spot where the toenail had been. The liquid soaked into the fabric, leaving a dark stain that smelled so strong it made my eyes water. "Just to be safe," she said with a grim smile. I spent the rest of my shift in a daze, replaying the moment over and over in my head. The way it brushed against my leg. The way it stuck there, like it had a life of its own. The way the guy looked at me, like he knew this was going to haunt me forever. I couldn't eat, I couldn't focus, and I definitely couldn't stop smelling that awful disinfectant. Story 4. I have a few, but I'll get the collective insanity one out of the way first. Having to go from shuffling bodies in and out of the overflowing morgue freezer, overflow morgue freezer, and overflowing autopsy freezer, so they didn't rot before the funeral homes caught up during the second COVID wave, to dealing with COVID denier/anti-mask morons at the hospital entrance screaming that COVID wasn't real. Back and forth, often within the same 5 minutes every shift. Those people had lost their minds, and I felt like I was about to too from dealing with them. A patient who had simultaneous medical and psych issues stripping naked and ripping a Foley catheter. If you're not familiar, they have an inflatable balloon on the end inside the patient's bladder to keep it in place. Out of his dick like he was starting a lawnmower, then standing there screaming with blood streaming out of his penis and pooling under his feet until we got in there and restrained him to a bed. One of my colleagues who went in with me had an armload of towels he was dumping onto the blood so that we didn't slip while wrestling with him. While working in a forensic psych setting, a guy came in who, despite being previously pretty normal, had stabbed his friend's daughter to death with a pair of scissors in the middle of the night. He then proceeded to attack police, attack nurses at the hospital he was brought to for self-inflicted injuries, attack correctional staff at the jail, and attack nurses at the jail before he finally ended up with us. Despite being in a high-security room, he managed to roll up a paper plate from his meal and stick it down his throat to try and asphyxiate himself. We ended up having to do a room entry with a shield to stop the attempt and restrain him. On a couple of occasions coming across cars that hadn't quite made it to the emergency entrance and having to pull out deathly gray OD victims to Narcan them, or finding GSW victims in the back seat and having to pick them up and run them into a trauma room. Getting a stat call to a locked dementia unit because staff had brought in a cake and 2 large kitchen knives and left them where a, surprisingly young, dementia patient, who was convinced the nurses were going to kill her to steal her organs, could find them. She proceeded to chase them around the unit double-fisting knives, and even slashed one of them between the shoulder blades before I got there and managed to get her to put them down. Having a man with severe alcohol withdrawal and a suspected head injury come in incoherent and shaking like a leaf. Even with half a dozen peace officers, EMS, and nurses holding him down, he was still moving too much to get Enforce started, and the IM meds weren't touching him. I ended up having to lay across his legs while nurses drilled an IO line directly into his shin bone, just to be able to meds him properly. I remember laying on his legs, looking up towards his head, and seeing eyes the exact same color as my son's looking back at me, clearly terrified and trying to say something, but too messed up to be able to form coherent words. Having to chase a young woman through the hospital after she came out of anesthesia badly, ripped out her IVs and ran screaming, naked, and bloody through the hallways until we caught up to her. I could go on. Maybe I should write a book. Story 5. I'd been assigned to a patient, a grumpy old man named Mr. H. He was 79, wiry but frail, with sharp blue eyes that could cut you down if you said the wrong thing. He had a sense of humor, but it was of the dry, crusty variety that made you tread carefully. I liked him, though. Beneath his rough edges, you could tell he was a decent man who'd been through a lot. Chronic pain and colon cancer will do that to a person. And then there was the loneliness. His wife had passed a few years earlier, and though his son visited every morning to catch the doctors on their rounds, you could see the weight of solitude pressing down on him the rest of the day. It was in the way he stared out the window, in the long silences between sentences. That morning started off like most mornings. I was helping Mr. H get ready for breakfast. He didn't complain too much, which was his way of saying he was in a decent mood. He was excited, actually. He'd just had a bunch of tests done, and he was anxious to hear the results. "If everything looks good," he told me, "they'll send me home. I can't wait to see my cat. Damn thing's probably forgotten I exist by now." He chuckled, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes that made me smile. His son wasn't able to make it that morning, which was unusual. Mr. H mentioned it casually, but didn't seem too bothered. When the doctor walked in, clipboard in hand, Mr. H asked me to stay. "In case they start throwing all those medical terms around," he said. "I don't want to miss something important." I hesitated for a moment. I wasn't sure how the doctor would feel about a student lingering in the room, but the doctor didn't seem to mind, so I stayed. The doctor didn't waste time with pleasantries. He got straight to the point, his voice calm but clinical, detached in that way doctors often are when delivering bad news. The tests had come back, and the results weren't good. The cancer had spread. There was nothing more they could do. He wouldn't be going home to his cat or anywhere else, not really. The palliative care team would be coming by later that afternoon to talk about transferring him to a facility for his final days. At first, Mr. H thought the doctor was joking. He actually laughed, and said, "Good one, document." But the doctor didn't laugh. He just stood there, waiting for the words to sink in. And then Mr. H went quiet, completely blank. He just stared at the doctor, his face frozen in this expression of disbelief, and something else. Something I couldn't quite place at the time. It wasn't fear, though. It was deeper than that. Like a piece of him had just been ripped out and replaced with nothing. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to say. I was not prepared for this, not by a long shot. They don't teach you how to comfort someone who's just been handed a death sentence. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. I just stood there, frozen, watching as the hope drained out of this man who, 10 minutes earlier, had been talking about how excited he was to go home. The doctor left shortly after, and I stayed behind, awkward and unsure, trying to offer some kind of support. But Mr. H didn't say a word. He just lay back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling. After a while, I excused myself and left the room, feeling like I'd failed him in some fundamental way. For the next week, Mr. H didn't get out of bed. He refused to eat, refused to take his medication, refused to shower. He barely even spoke. It was like he wasn't there anymore, like the news had hollowed him out and left only a shell behind. I tried to talk to him, tried to coax him into eating or sitting up, but he just shook his head and turned away. The light in his eyes was gone. He didn't even look like the same person. And the smell in his room, stale, sour, like decay, seemed to grow stronger every day, no matter how often the staff cleaned. Then one morning, I came in for my shift, and Mr. H was gone. Transferred to palliative care, they said, but the room didn't feel empty. I don't know how to explain it, but the air in there felt wrong. Heavy, like something had been left behind. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, but as the day went on, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I wasn't alone whenever I walked past that room. That night, I stayed late to finish some charting, and the halls were quiet. Most of the patients were asleep, and the lights had been dimmed. I passed by Mr. H's old room on my way to the supply closet, and for some reason I couldn't explain, I stopped. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see the empty bed inside, the sheets stripped, the furniture bare. But as I stood there, staring into the room, I thought I heard something. A faint sound like whispering. I stepped closer, holding my breath, and listened. "Can't wait to see my cat." The voice was so soft I almost thought I'd imagined it. But it was his voice. I know it was. My stomach dropped, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I backed away from the door. The whispering stopped, but the air in the room still felt oppressive, like it was pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I turned and practically ran back to the nurse's station, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't tell anyone what I heard. Who would believe me? But I avoided that room for the rest of my rotation, And even now, years later, I still think about Mr. H. I think about that blank look on his face when the doctor told him he was dying. I think about the way he gave up, the way he let himself fade away. And I think about that whisper, soft and sad, echoing out of an empty room. Sometimes I wonder if he ever made it home to his cat. Maybe in some way he did. But part of me thinks he never left that room, that a piece of him is still there waiting. For what, I don't know. But every now and then, when I'm working a late shift and the halls are quiet, I swear I can still hear his voice, faint and distant, just beyond the edge of hearing. Can't wait to see my cat. Story 6. Let me go over one of the worst experiences I've ever had during my time working through clinicals in high school. It was part of a CNA course I was taking, and our clinical rotations were at a state-run nursing home. If you've never been in one of those places, let me paint you a picture. The air is always stale, a mix of disinfectant and something faintly sour that you can never quite place. The halls are dimly lit, the fluorescent bulbs buzzing faintly overhead, and the sound of muffled televisions, coughing, and creaking wheelchairs echoes endlessly through the corridors. It's a heavy place, weighed down by time and memories, and for the residents, it's often the last stop before the end for someone. There was one patient there who I will never forget ever. Her name was Mrs. L. She was 89 years old, with stage 4 pancreatic cancer and late-stage dementia. A tragic combination, to say the least. Her body was betraying her, piece by piece, and her mind wasn't far behind. Mrs. L had lived a long life, but it was a hard one. She'd been married once, but her husband had died years ago. They'd had 8 children together, but all of them were gone too. Her siblings, her friends, everyone she'd ever been close to, they were all dead. She had no one left. No visitors, no family to hold her hand or sit by her bedside. Just the staff and the occasional student like me. She'd come to the nursing home about 4 years before I met her. Back then, she'd been frail but still sharp enough to realize she couldn't live on her own anymore. Age had caught up to her, as it does to all of us, and she moved in when she could no longer care for herself. But by the time I started my clinicals, the cancer and dementia had taken over. Most days, Mrs. L didn't know where she was. She'd sit in her bed or her wheelchair, staring blankly at whatever was in front of her, mumbling to herself or calling out for people who hadn't been alive in decades. But every now and then, she'd have a lucid day. And those were the hardest days of all. On those days, she'd remember everything. Her cancer, her children, her siblings, the fact that she was completely, utterly alone in the world. She'd cry for hours, her frail shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the deepest part of her soul. There's something about seeing someone cry like that, someone who knows they're at the end of their life and has no one left to comfort them. It's a kind of sadness that stays with you, no matter how much time passes. As her condition worsened, those lucid days grew further and further apart. The cancer was eating away at her, and it was clear to everyone that she didn't have much time left. She stopped responding to most of the staff, refusing to eat or drink unless I was the one feeding her. I don't know why she trusted me. Maybe it was because I was young and reminded her of someone she used to know. Or maybe it was just a coincidence. Either way, I couldn't bring myself to let her waste away, so I started going in on weekends and after school. I'd sit with her, coaxing her to take a few bites of food or sip some water. Sometimes she'd look at me with this strange, faraway expression, like she was trying to place me, trying to figure out who I was. I thought maybe she mistook me for a nurse or a friend, but I didn't know the truth until much later. The day she died was quiet, almost unnervingly so. I came in after school, and the air in the nursing home felt heavier than usual. There was a kind of stillness in the halls, like everyone, staff and residents alike, knew something had happened. When I walked past Mrs. L's room, I saw the staff cleaning it out, packing up her few belongings into a small box. She hadn't had much. A couple of faded dresses, some old books, and a handful of black and white photographs. As I lingered outside the door, one of the pictures caught my eye. It was of a young woman, probably in her early 20s, standing in front of a house with a broad smile on her face. She was holding a basket of flowers, and the sunlight caught her hair in a way that made it shine. I froze when I saw it. She looked familiar, too familiar. She looked like me. Not exactly, of course. The woman in the photo had softer features, and her hair was styled differently, but there was enough of a resemblance to make my stomach drop. One of the nurses noticed me staring and came over. "That's her sister," she said, gesturing to the photo. "She passed away a long time ago." And just like that, it all clicked. Mrs. L hadn't trusted me because I was kind, or because I'd taken the time to sit with her. She'd trusted me because she thought I was her sister. That faraway look she'd give me sometimes, it wasn't confusion. It was recognition, or at least, what her mind thought was recognition. She thought I'd come back for her, that she wasn't alone after all. I didn't know how to feel about that. On one hand, I was glad I could bring her some comfort, even if it was based on a misunderstanding. But on the other hand, it made her death even harder to process. She'd spent her final days clinging to a memory, to a ghost. And now, all that was left of her was an empty room and a box of belongings. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about her, about the way she'd looked at me, about the picture of her sister. I told myself it was over, that she was at peace now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lingering. I don't know if it was guilt or sadness or something else entirely, but it kept me awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying those final weeks in my mind. The next time I went to the nursing home, I avoided her old room. I didn't want to see who'd been moved in there, didn't want to walk past and feel that emptiness all over again. But as I was leaving at the end of my shift, I thought I heard someone call my name. It was faint, almost lost in the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant chatter of the staff. I turned, but the hallway behind me was empty. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then it happened once again, and then again. Always when I was near her old room, always faint, always just out of reach. It wasn't until the last time, when I heard it so clearly it stopped me in my tracks, that I realized it wasn't my name she was calling. It was her sister's. Story 7. The ICU is a place where the human body's frailty is laid bare. It's raw, unfiltered, and unapologetically grim. It's where people teeter between life and death, where every beep of the monitor, every syringe of medication, every desperate compression of a chest echoes in the space between hope and inevitability. I've seen a lot of things that would make most people turn pale and be sick. But some nights, some rooms, stick with you indefinitely. Last night was one of those nights. Not for the faint of heart. Bed 26. She was supposed to be a simple case. A routine elective colostomy reversal. But nothing in the ICU is ever as simple as it's supposed to be. I walked into her room to help with a turn, and the sight of her stopped me dead in my tracks. It wasn't just her physical state, though that was enough to make your stomach lurch. It was her eyes. They were empty. Not the kind of empty you see in someone who's sedated or unconscious, but the kind of empty that says, I've already given up. They didn't move, didn't track me or the nurse standing beside me. Just stared straight ahead, glassy and hollow, like she was already halfway gone. Her body was a battlefield. She was tracheed and on a ventilator, her chest rising and falling mechanically, the sound of the machine filling the room. Her abdomen was open, a massive wound vac covering the gaping hole where her surgeries had failed her again and again. The skin around it looked raw, angry, and impossibly fragile. She was covered in blisters, her body so edematous that her skin was literally weeping fluid. She was wrapped from head to toe in Chuck's pads, not because it was protocol, but because there was no other way to control the constant drainage. The air in the room was heavy with the smell of antiseptic, blood, and something sour and metallic that clung to your nostrils long after you stepped out. The worst part? She didn't want the surgery, not really. She said her family had pressured her into it. They couldn't stand the smell of her colostomy bag, couldn't handle the inconvenience of her condition. And now here she was, a broken shell of a person, stuck in a cycle of surgeries, infections, and interventions she never asked for. I stood there, staring at her, and all I could think was, this wasn't supposed to happen. She was just trying to go home, bless her. Bed 16. I went in to check on the alarms. Nothing unusual. We're used to the constant beeping, the endless symphony of machines fighting to keep people alive. But when I glanced at the patient's toes, I froze. They were purple. Not just poor circulation purple, but the kind of purple that means the tissue is dead. I mentioned it to the primary nurse, trying to keep my voice even, and she barely looked up before saying, "Just wait until you see her arm." I didn't want to see her arm, but I looked anyway, and that's when I saw it. Her arm was black. Not mottled, not bruised black. From her fingertips to her elbow, her arm looked like it had been carved out of obsidian. It was smooth, waxy, and lifeless, like something you'd see in a nightmare. The sight of it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't help but ask, "She looks dead. Is she with it?" The nurse glanced at me, her face devoid of emotion, and said flatly, "She blinks." That's the thing about the ICU. You see people existing in this liminal space, where they're technically alive but not really living. Her family wanted everything done. Every possible intervention, every procedure, no matter how futile. And so there she lay, her body slowly succumbing to necrosis, her mind trapped in a silent prison. I couldn't stop thinking about her as I moved on to the next room. About what it must feel like to blink, to be aware enough to know your body is dying piece by piece, and to be unable to do anything about it. Bed 19, the cursed room. I don't believe in curses, not really. But there's something about bed 19 that makes you wonder. It's the room where things just go wrong. And last night was no exception. The patient came in after a STEMI, a severe heart attack, straight from the cath lab. By the time he got here, he'd already coded 3 times during the procedure. They were running levofed wide open, which is ICU speak for maxing out a drug that's supposed to keep your blood pressure from bottoming out. The cath lab called ahead, warning us they were coming in hot and doing compressions en route. Gown up, they said, and we knew it was going to be bad. The gurney came flying around the corner with a resident perched on top, doing chest compressions on a frail old man covered in blood. It was chaos. More staff poured into the room than I'd ever seen during a code. At least 10 doctors, residents, and nurses swarming around the bed, shouting orders, pushing drugs, and trying to bring him back. It was like a macabre dance, choreographed by desperation. I was tasked with bringing the family in. There were over 20 of them, crammed into the waiting area, their faces lighting up with hope when they saw me. I smiled stupidly, an automatic reflex, a way to break the tension, but the words I had to say killed that hope in an instant. He's not doing well, I told them. We're doing everything we can, but he's not going to live much longer. You need to see him now. I'll never forget the way their faces changed as the words sank in. The smiles faded, replaced by wide, tear-filled eyes and pale expressions. They followed me into the room, where the staff was still doing compressions, still fighting to save someone who was already gone. The family collapsed around the bed, crying, praying, begging us not to stop. It was chaos in every sense of the word. The floor was slick with blood, the crash carts were empty, and after 10+ rounds of AP we finally called it. No miracle. Bed 19, Part 2. An hour later, Bed 19 was empty, the previous patient wheeled out by the funeral home. We barely had time to breathe before the next one came in. A rapid response from the med-surg floor. This patient had suffered a massive hemorrhagic stroke and was deteriorating fast. By the time she got to us, she was unresponsive, snoring heavily, and showing clear signs of decerebrate posturing. Her body stiff and rigid, her arms extended at her sides, her hands curling inward. It's one of those signs you don't need a medical degree to understand. It means the brain is dying. She was a DNR, but the family rescinded it at the last second. And so we intubated her. We did what we always do, prolonging the inevitable because we have to, because the family isn't ready to let go. But as I stood there, watching her body fight against the ventilator, I couldn't help but wonder if we were doing her any favors. If she could speak, would she want this? Would she want to spend her final moments surrounded by machines, her body contorted, her dignity stripped away? The ICU is full of stories like these. Stories of suffering, of hope, of desperation, of loss. But the hardest ones to swallow are the ones where we know deep down that we're only prolonging the suffering, that the patient is already gone, even if their heart is still beating. Those are the stories that stick with you. The ones that keep you up at night, replaying the sounds, the smells, the sights. Story 8. I currently work on an intensive unit. I've seen so much. And I don't believe anything has hit me as hard as below. I was working at a mental health facility after graduating from undergrad. This facility was interesting. It was in a modest, ranch-styled house that was made specifically for this population, open layout for easy supervision, panic buttons, etc. But mostly it was a house and the staff were the outliers. There were 8 clients at a time. They would either get re-hospitalized or go on to independent living. It was a step above being hospitalized. I got extremely close to these consumers and got to know them very well. I have many stories of their antics, good and bad memories, but I recall a certain individual whose situation really hurt. I was specifically hired for a man in his 60s, M, who had suffered a traumatic brain injury, TBI. M was a successful toy marketer in his past life, as his family called it. One day, 20-something years earlier, M got into a horrific car accident. He survived, but was cursed with poor memory and severe PTSD. many psychological issues and physical concerns. M would scream every 2 minutes, on the dot, begging staff to not bring him to the hospital. He would ask if he were okay. It was difficult for him to communicate, but he would get moments of clarity. He was a big man, who seemed intimidating when he had these bouts. He had come to us with the diagnosis of bipolar with a history of violence. M was never violent towards our staff, and we knew that he was pawned off to us because his insurance was no longer covering the hospitalization, and his family did not want to take care of him. It was a lot to take care of him, but he quickly stole a place in my heart. He remembered my name because his sister's name was the same, but other than that, he did not recognize any other staff members and did not remember his day-to-day living. He needed help showering and would be embarrassed to have a 20-something-year-old woman helping him, and would cry, whispering, "Not fair." We watched Titanic every single shift together. He liked Rose and wouldn't scream when we would watch movies together. M loved Diet Root beer and would smile every so often when I brought it to him. When I indicated that he couldn't go to the hospital when I bought him root beer, he would be still until his next outburst. I would be able to successfully de-escalate once I showed him his Diet Root beer and helped him drink it. I bought 300 movies on VHS for us to watch together because it was the only thing that calmed him down. M was much more than his impairment. He was still a human, one who I grew fond of because I could not grasp the immeasurable pain he was in. His wife abandoned him after it was deemed he would not sign divorce papers. She wanted him to die so that she could take his money. I never met her. He had sons, and he pleaded for them to come, but I only saw one once. He only stayed for a half hour. I think M saw me as his form of family, telling me that I was his daughter when he never had one. The other staff did not like M as much as me. They petitioned for him to be sent to a nursing home because his care was too much. I would miss M, but hoped for him a better life, mostly for him to have staff trained in adults with memory issues. I never got to say goodbye. He got transported by medical staff to his new nursing home. Fast forward a year. I am happy in my new role, being promoted to a closer hospital to home. I get a text message from a past coworker. My old coworker sent me a lengthy email from M's sister. M's sister wrote that M began to decompensate very quickly. He was rarely changed or paid attention to. He was left alone in a dark room, with no T.V, nothing to occupy his mind. M had died. M's sister thanked me for the care I gave him for our Scrabble matches. He would often make up words. I never let them fly. He would giggle. I think he thought he could pull one over on me. For our movie sessions, for all the joy I had brought to his life of worry. She signed that she was grateful and that she would never forget me. She thanked me again and told me that she could never repay me for the time I gave to her brother. I sat in my office, curled up in a ball, and sobbed for 10 minutes. I couldn't believe that the stubborn, forgetful, aloof M that I knew was gone. I sobbed because I didn't get to say goodbye or send him off with his favorite tape. But mostly I cried due to the neglect that is the reality of some healthcare systems. M did not deserve to go the way he did. I think back to that letter, and know my time with M taught me a lot more than I could have ever hoped for. He brought me more joy than I probably brought him. His sister thanked me for my time with him, but I am thankful for the honor of knowing him. M, wherever you are, I hope you have endless reruns of Titanic and Diet Root beer. Maybe we can play Scrabble one day. But most of all, I hope you have the peace that you deserved. Story 9. I was working patient relations at a hospital in Ohio, and there was this dude named Mike, no more than 20 years old, that came in and hung out in an out-of-the-way lobby almost every week. Mike was one of those guys that never saw anything negative in this life, and made sure to do his best to help others only see the positive. He was easily one of the strongest people I have ever met. Whenever I'd see him with a smile as wide as the horizon, he'd greet me with one of those hand slap/hug things that bros do. Seeing Mike was always the highlight of my week. Mike always brought a guitar and a backpack with him, and whenever I saw him we'd sit down and play guitar together and obsess over common music interests. He had great taste and amazing recommendations for new stuff to listen to. Dude wrote his own stuff too, and showed me some of his lyrics. Let's just say, he could have easily made a living by doing music. Months went by of seeing Mike every week at least once, sometimes twice. I never saw any relatives or anything, so I thought he was just there to visit someone, and was usually taking a break. You're not really supposed to ask why people are in a hospital. It's bad etiquette, at least for the position I held. It wasn't until the very last day I ever saw him that a member of the oncology cancer unit met Mike in the lobby with an empty wheelchair. The staff member exclaimed towards Mike that he doesn't know why Mike shows up so early and why they always have to look for him. It was then I started piecing it together. One of the registrars called me over to her desk after oncology whisked Mike away in a wheelchair. Mike, of course, insisting the whole way that he can and should walk. The registrar filled in the broken pieces for me. I know, HIPAA violation. Mike was 19. Mike had stage 3 cancer. Mike came to the hospital for his chemo. Mike didn't have any family, so he came alone from a sort of homeless shelter for young adults, hours early for his treatments because that was the only time the bus schedule came by. I never saw Mike again after that day. Couldn't find his room, asked people about him, nothing. I called all the homeless shelters in the area, nothing. I might have asked the wrong people or just simply missed him, and he moved on to somewhere else, but for whatever the case, I never saw him again. Mike was the living embodiment of love and strength. I had no idea what he was going through and that he was doing it alone, but the fucker would probably just say with a humongous grin, "I'm not alone. I've got you and everyone in this hospital. We're all family anyways." To this day I still think about and pray for him, and hold on to the hope that I might see him again, and tell him about the song I learned on guitar by one of his 9 favorite bands. Another one from my family member. R.N. I was working as a floater, meaning I could be assigned to any floor in the hospital. I was sent to a regular medical, surgical floor. I heard my patient before I met her. She was screaming. She was a Spanish-speaking woman in her 40s that had a stroke previously, was from a nursing home, admitted for a broken leg. She had a plaster cast on her lower right leg, toes exposed, and there was a wet spot on the cast's heel and a foul odor in the room. The permanent nursing staff informed me that this was just her regular state, screaming, and to medicate her with whatever pain meds were ordered. I had a sixth sense that something was seriously wrong, and that her screaming wasn't just altered mental status secondary to an infarction. From 7 a.m. onward I informed the surgical team that this was more than just confusion, and as a per diem staff was not being listened to. This went on for hours with my warring with the doctors who refused to take it seriously, and at best ordered an antipsychotic, which made zero difference in her mental status. I finally called the nursing supervisor in tears, who listened to my concerns and escalated the matter by speaking directly to the head of orthopedics. 2 residents immediately appeared, and the cast was removed 5 hours later. This poor woman had a stage 4 pressure ulcer on her heel, basically a wound that is deep and rotting with infection. The cast had placed pressure on her already compromised skin, and it was a disaster in the making. I followed up with what happened to her, and I was told they ended up doing a below-the-knee amputation. Unfortunately, I have a lot more stories that I could share. I ended up going into home hospice, where patient care was a priority. If your loved one is in the hospital and can't speak for themselves, make sure you advocate for them. Just remembered having a patient that was admitted with prostate issues. He was intermittently bleeding from his privates. He was also continuously playing with himself. So basically you would walk in his room to find him in a state of ecstasy, furiously rubbing himself with blood everywhere. The only patient I refused to care for, and had another nurse take over, thankfully. Story 10. I've been an RN for 25 years, 3 in an ICU, 10 in an ER, a few short stints in OR, and the last 11 years in Psych ER. Reading this has dredged up a lot of stuff. ICU maybe 20 to 22 years ago. Poor man had cancer, big tumor in his chest compressing his superior vena cava syndrome. He was struggling to breath. I had his bed upright, and he had on 100% O2 with a non-rebreather. He had orders for 1 milligram of morphine an hour as needed, fuck all. This wasn't a teaching hospital, so the nurses would call the patient's doc at home as there were no docs, residents, etc. there, and explain what was up. I could not get an order for anything to help this guy. I felt pretty helpless because he was struggling to breath. I stayed with him most of the shift until I went home. I don't know what happened as I didn't see him again. Years later, in ER, a young guy with Marfan's syndrome came in. His color was shit. He was very diaphoretic. Doc suspected a dissecting aneurysm. He kept asking me for some water. I had to say I couldn't right now, but would soon, lying because he was going to wind up intubated. You can't give anyone anything by mouth for fear of aspiration. He struggled for a while and coded and died. I felt like crap that the last thing he wanted was water, and I couldn't give him any. 20 years ago, a code on a man Christmas Eve, which was unsuccessful. We cleaned up the room for his wife who was en route. but in deaths like that you have to leave in the lines, ET tubes, etc., for the medical examiner. Anyway, we had things as tidy as possible. I went on to some other stuff in the ER happening, and at shift change I was leaving. I saw the patient's wife alone in the room we coded him in, sitting on a chair holding his hand and being quiet. I always see that image. 3 guys drove to the ER after dust in a grain silo. They were ignited and they were burned bad. They walked in, clothes, skin, etc. Total horrendous mess. Each patient got 2 nurses, and we went to work. I was down on one knee cutting this guy's bootlaces and skin, and such was dripping on my arm. Once I got the boots off, I went to reach what I thought was a bunched up shirt sleeve, but it actually was the skin on his arm having sloughed down to his wrist. It was all as bad as it sounds. Guy kills his female, so with an axe to the head. She's in one room being worked on. He was in another for a reason I forget, and he would scream, "Is the bitch dead?" frequently. Drunk drivers crying while being treated as they knew they had killed someone, and alternately drunk drivers being asses, all entitled about what they needed, etc., and they had killed someone. Man came into ER, dissecting aneurysm but quite stable, vitals all good, pleasant, talkative. I kept checking his vitals regularly, all within normal limits. I hear him call out "nurse," and when I go in he asked for a basin, because he was spitting up blood. Aneurysm let go really fast, he was out, hard to intubate due to all the blood, and when they finally got the tube and blood came from it copiously. He didn't make it. They figure his aneurysm involved the pulmonary vein. On and on and on, and I haven't even touched on my psych experience. I hope I can retire in 10 years. I consider myself a tough nurse with regards to all this, but the psych work, with all the aggression we see the past few years, I am a big guy with muscle, so angry patients tend to go for me. I get apprehensive going to work sometimes. It's an area I want to remain in, however. Sure wish I could afford to retire though. 25 years isn't a super long career, but it's pretty good. As mentioned, I guess I'll be at this 10 more years. And another story before I go from my colleague, who shares her worst experiences. My worst experiences? Well, probably the middle-aged trauma patient whose car had been smashed by a falling tree during a windstorm. Her teenage son had died in the accident. She has short-term memory loss due to the traumatic brain injury she sustained, so she kept learning that her son had died, being devastated, and then forgetting and having to experience hearing that news for the first time over and over again. There are a few more experiences I will share below. Guy had some sort of trauma/emergency and ended up being left on a backboard way too long while being moved from the scene to a hospital to the CT scanner to an ambulance to another hospital and then eventually to my hospital. He was on the backboard for like 12 hours or something horrible like that. By the time he got to my hospital, he had horrific pressure ulcers on his sacrum and occiput, back of his head. I took care of him in the OR for a debridement of the ulcers. They were full thickness down to the bone and huge, like the one on his head was the size of a CD, and the sacral ulcer was almost the size of a dinner plate. The smell was horrendous. It was terrible. Otherwise healthy guy in his 50s had a clot from new onset of fib travel to the basilar artery of his brain. It caused the entire posterior circulation of his brain to stroke and then bleed, and the clot was propagating, and by the time he arrived to us there was nothing we could do. He arrived somewhat interactive, but then over the first 12 to 24 hours he got progressively more and more somnolent, got intubated, and was then completely comatose and likely brain dead. I was an ICU fellow at the time, and was the main physician communicating with his lovely family, which included his wife, his high school sweetheart, and a son my age for the several days he was in the unit. Their other son had died in a car accident when he was 18. I'll never forget sitting on the floor of the ICU hallway with his wife, and just holding her as she sobbed after we made the decision together to withdraw the ventilator and transition to comfort care. I was such a mess, and the angel who was his nurse that day was comforting me. A few weeks later, the family sent me this beautiful letter telling me more about him, who he was, and how much he was loved, and I lost it again. Another stroke patient, this time when I was an intern. 40-year-old healthy Japanese woman was showering before heading to the airport to head back to Japan after a visit to her husband's family in the States, and had a devastating rupture of a cerebral aneurysm. She arrived to us in very bad shape and ended up brain dead very quickly. I was an intern and was tasked with having goals of care discussions with her whole family, along with the chaplain, thank goodness, via a translator at 3 a.m. once they arrived from Tokyo. I had to tell them that she was dead. It was heartbreaking. I'll never forget her sister seeing her for the first time, and just crying her name over and over again. They declined organ donation, so our nurses lovingly took all her lines and tubes out, brushed her hair, and cleaned her up. She was so beautiful, looked like she was just sleeping. That one hit me hard. Previously healthy 20-year-old girl fell off her bike, got a small cut on her knee, and 12 hours later was getting all the skin debrided off her entire leg/pelvis/abdomen due to necrotizing fasciitis. A co-resident's mom came in with a brain abscess from a dental source. It ruptured into her ventricles. She died. A woman with calciphylaxis all over her body. That led to painful, miserable skin necrosis over most of her body, which required multiple horribly painful dressing changes daily. Saw her while rotating on the acute pain service. Cranky vascular patient who had been in-house for weeks for serial amputations transferred down to my ICU from the floor after the chief resident arrived on AM rounds to find him less responsive than normal. By the time he hit the unit, I did a quick neuro exam and realized he was posturing with a blown pupil. He was obviously herniating, so we intubated him and did all the intracranial pressure-lowering maneuvers we could. Stat CT scan showed, unsurprisingly, a massive brain bleed with downward herniation. Neurosurgery realized it was unsurvivable and declined to intervene. The fucked up thing was that he had refused to provide any contact information for any family. It was a Sunday, so his caseworker that we were able to identify after an hour or two digging through the chart wasn't available. So we made a two-physician to withdraw support, and he died immediately. There was nobody to tell. That was the worst part. Old woman transferred to us from another hospital with impending airway loss. She had a tongue tumor that she had first noticed about 2 weeks prior. It was biopsied and found to be squamous cell cancer. She had been planning to get surgery and chemo/radiation, but then the tumor rapidly grew over several days. When she arrived to us, she was clearly in a panic. Her tongue was huge, protruding out of her mouth, black and necrotic, and smelled horrible. Her sweet husband was there with her, and was totally beside himself with worry and sorrow. I got the Yenti surgeons in the room immediately, ready to trach at a moment's notice, and then did an urgent awake nasal fiber optic intubation. Poor lady's cancer was so advanced that she had basically no options other than a trach and some palliative care. The worst part for her was the smell. It was just necrotic and disgusting and right by her nose. She was desperate to have it gone, but the surgeons realized there was no way they could remove it without removing a huge portion of her jaw/neck along with it. When I was about to graduate from fellowship, literally like my last 1 or 2 weeks, I took over from the night fellow, and one of the patients was an elderly gentleman who had just come out of the ER after a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm repair. He had been DNR, but had opted for surgery versus dying from his aneurysm. The problem with that is that even if you survive the initial aneurysm rupture and the surgery, the recovery is long and protracted and the mortality is still pretty high. Not 10 minutes after I took over the service, the nurse came to grab me to tell me he was unstable. He was getting more and more hypotensive and more difficult to oxygenate, and his vitals weren't responsive to fluids. I was worried about abdominal compartment syndrome, increased pressures inside a closed abdomen from swelling/extra fluid, which can happen after a massive surgery and resuscitation like he had, but his bladder pressures were normal. So then I started to fear the worst, dead bowels. It felt like it took forever for a surgeon to get there, during which time I was going up and up and up on the pressors, and had basically maxed out what I could do with the ventilator, and his pressures were still low, and his oxygen sats were in the 60% range. Finally, the surgeon showed up and decided that she was also worried about dead bowels, and that since he was too unstable for transport to the ER, we'd have to do an exploratory laparotomy at the bedside in the ICU. I remember standing at the head of the bed, my comfort zone as an anesthesiologist, but instead of pushing anesthetic meds, I was pushing epinephrine boluses. They opened up and found his entire colon completely black and dead, realized there was nothing that could be done, and closed up. I had to call his wife and tell her. She was too old and frail to travel to the hospital, so I just had to get her blessing to withdraw support and try to give her some comfort over the phone.